So now that we've discussed a little bit about the theory behind CSS, let's look at a couple of examples of CSS, and in particular I want to talk to you about working with inline CSS and internal CSS. First and foremost, this untitled document in the title is bugging me, so I'm just going to change that to Tales of Mystery and Imagination. And I'll go to File, Save, and we will make sure that that's saved. All right, so what can we do with internal and inline CSS, and why do we want to use them? Well, you might remember that in the last video tutorial I mentioned to you that the best way for us to work with CSS is through external CSS. However, there are different ways of creating CSS that go beyond external CSS. Now I'll be showing you these ways, but generally speaking, we still want to look at the external CSS paradigm as the best way of styling our page. Nevertheless, though, there are going to be some times when you want to work in this fashion, and I could see this being done maybe for a one-page website, or maybe sending a HTML styled email. So these are things that are specific to, individual examples, but not necessarily something that you would use on a regular basis. Okay, first thing I want to do is talk to you about the Properties window, and you'll notice that in the Properties window there are two buttons located at the bottom left here, one for HTML and one for CSS. Now we've already explored how the HTML section enables us to format text and to do different things. So if I position my cursor here, we see it's formatted as a H1 or a H2 or a H3 or a paragraph. So let's imagine, as you can see in the first paragraph, there is the word the, and it's actually capitalized. So what I want you to do is to go to the Properties window and click on CSS. Now here it says Targeted Rule, New CSS Rule. If you click down on this section, what I would like you to do is to say New Inline Style. And if we do say New Inline Style, this will allow us to create an inline style. And an inline style is something that is found generally in the body section of your document, inline. And it's one of the first methods of CSS styling. So let's imagine that we wanted to select the word the and just turn it into something red. So I'll go over to the text color area here, click on it, and choose red. Well, let's examine what's happened. First of all, in the design view, you can see that the word the is in fact red. And if we now examine the code view, we can also see something else that's happened. First of all, Dreamweaver has created a span tag, and the span is wrapping around the word the. Open and closing span tag. And within that span tag, there is an attribute that says style equals color, and it has a hexadecimal value for that particular color, in this case red. Well, that looks great, and it looks fairly easy. And for example, let's say I wanted to select the first letter, or the first word rather, of the second paragraph, the word perhaps, and let's say we do the same thing, and I come in here and I turn it red as well. In order to do so, you would have to go to the New Inline Styles and click on red. Well, as you can see, another span tag has been created with the attribute style color. Okay, now while that might seem fairly easy enough to do, it's not really advantageous. It's very much like that antiquated method of styling and coloring your text that we saw in the previous video using the font tag. Now, as I mentioned in the previous video, using the font tag is kind of a clumsy way of working. If this was done over 100 pages and I needed to make changes, I would have to go in and select each one of these and go about changing them from red to green or whatever we wanted to do. Now, while that seems simple enough on a one-page example, if this was a 100-page example, this would be very problematic. So again, I would resist using this method And I would only do so in certain situations, like, as I mentioned earlier, perhaps an email HTML message or something along those lines, which are only really one page in existence. Okay, now that we've seen how that's done, I'm actually going to undo those by going to either Edit, Undo, Command Z on the Mac, Control Z on a PC. So I'll just say Control Z, Command Z if you're on a Mac, and we'll go back to the way we were before. Okay, that sounds great for inline. Now let me show you an example of internal CSS. Let's say, for example, I wanted all of my paragraphs to be styled a color red. So look what I'm going to do. I'm going to select this entire paragraph, and you'll see it in the code view here. P to P has been in fact selected. And in the properties window where it says CSS, we're going to say new targeted or targeted rule. It's not a new inline style. This time we're saying a new CSS rule. And if I were to come in here and choose red, the new CSS rule window opens up. Now we're going to talk more about these individual selector types as we go through them, especially when we're dealing with the external examples in the next video. But right now, let's imagine we wanted to come in here and say, I want to redefine what all of my P paragraph tags look like. So the HTML element, the P paragraph element, is going to be redefined in this fashion. So in other words, all paragraphs will be red. Look at this area down at the bottom where it says rule definition. Choose where your rule will be defined. Well, if we wanted to create an internal example, as we are doing right now, all we say is this document only. So in other words, just like inline, internal only styles this one page. It does not handle the styling of paragraphs in the entire document. So if I had 100 pages, this would only be styling the one page. So if we click OK, let's take a look. First of all, you can see that every single one of my paragraphs has now been styled the color red, and any headlines have not. So you can see that the headlines are still black, but everything else has been turned red. All right, well, that seems like it's pretty cool, but let's examine what's going on inside of our code view. Well, in the head section, and I'm just going to highlight that head section. So notice this is not written inline. It's not written inside of the body section. This is actually being handled inside of the head section of this document. And let's see what it's done. It's introduced a style tag, open and closing style. And within that style tag, there is a CSS definition, a CSS rule that has been declared. There is the P as the selector, and the property is color, and the value is the hexadecimal value for red. So what is this doing? This is saying make all paragraphs on this particular page be the color red. And that's it. If I have another page, which I do, by the way, I'm just going to go to my Files window and open up the Pit page. Take a look at the paragraphs here. They're not red. And the reason they are not red, I'm going to close that now, is because internal styles, as we've created here in the head section of our document, only affects this one page. So while this is more advantageous than the inline method that we just saw, for example, if I wanted all of my paragraphs to be red using inline, I would have to select this paragraph, I would have to say new inline style and make it red. Or let's say I'll make it green, for example. Notice style color attribute has been added to the P paragraph tag. Well, I would have had to have done that for every single one of these paragraphs in an inline example. Not really a great way to do it, because then I'd have to go about changing all of this information. So I'm going to delete that information and refresh my page in the property window and return back to normal. But as you can see, the internal method allows you to make one declaration and all of these paragraphs are turned red. So that seems okay, but still not the most advantageous if you're working with a multiple page website. Even 4 pages, as we have in our example, will still be better suited by using external CSS. One last thing before we leave. CSS stands for cascading style sheets, which means, much like a waterfall cascades, CSS has an order of hierarchy. What that also means is that the first thing the browser is going to do is say, do you have any inline styles in the body? And if so, that will take precedence over internal styles, which are in the head section. And the internal styles will take precedence over the external styles, which we're going to do in the next video. So you might say, if I write something in the external style sheet, I can still come in on this page and change it. So if the external style sheet says make all paragraphs be green, and then I come internally here and say make all paragraphs be red, internal will take precedence over the external. So does that mean that we should be using internal and external even on 100-page websites? Well, probably not. There's still better ways of handling this with custom classes, among other things. And again, it's still much better to do so in an external environment. So come back in the next video and we'll start talking about working with external text. Before we do that, let me just take the style that we've got right here as an internal example, which I will delete and refresh. We're back to normal, and we're back to getting ready for our external CSS example.